The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of Forward Operating Base Crimson. Lieutenant Colonel Vera Ghost Kozlova pressed her ear closer to the communication device, her weathered fingers adjusting the frequency dial with practiced precision. What she heard next would change everything she thought she knew about impossible missions. Ghost, this is Reaper 6. We have a situation developing in the Kandahar Valley. SEAL Team 7 is pinned down, taking heavy fire from fortified positions. Close air support is requested immediately. The voice belonged to Major Rick Hansen, and even through the electronic distortion, she could hear something she'd never detected before in his transmissions: desperation. Kozlova's ice-blue eyes scanned the tactical display mounted on the wall of the operations center. Red dots clustered in a valley formation that intelligence had designated as a low-priority sector just 48 hours ago. Now those same coordinates were lighting up like a Christmas tree, with heat signatures indicating at least 3 companies of enemy fighters dug into positions that would make a mountain goat think twice. Reaper 6, Ghost copies. What's your current status? She replied, already reaching for her flight suit. The worn leather jacket bore patches from 3 different theaters of operation, each one a testament to missions that weren't supposed to be survivable. We're down to 60% effective strength. Lost our forward observer 20 minutes ago. Enemy has us zeroed in with mortars and what appears to be multiple RPG teams. We need close air support now, or we're going to have to consider extraction under fire. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. SEAL Team 7 didn't ask for extraction. They were the ones who extracted others. These were operators who had conducted raids behind enemy lines in Syria, cleared buildings in Fallujah, and hunted high-value targets through the mountains of Afghanistan for over 2 decades. If they were calling for help, the situation had moved beyond critical into something approaching catastrophic. Kozlova's mind raced through the tactical possibilities. The valley was a natural kill zone, surrounded by ridgelines that provided perfect enfilade fire positions. Approaching aircraft would be vulnerable from multiple directions, flying into a corridor of concentrated anti-aircraft fire that would challenge even the most advanced fighters. Standard doctrine called for artillery preparation, multiple attack runs with coordinated suppression, and preferably a full squadron of aircraft working in pairs. Ghost, be advised, weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Visibility dropping to near zero, with wind shear reported at multiple altitudes. Command is recommending we wait for conditions to improve. She looked out through the reinforced window of the operations center. Dawn was still 3 hours away, and the mountain peaks were already disappearing into low-hanging clouds that seemed to swirl with malevolent intent. The kind of weather that turned routine flights into nightmare scenarios, where instruments became lifelines and visual references vanished into gray nothingness. But somewhere in that valley, the best of America's special operations forces were bleeding out in positions they couldn't abandon and couldn't hold. The operations center fell silent except for the steady hum of electronics and the distant sound of generators. 3 junior officers watched her with expressions that mixed hope and skepticism. They knew her reputation, but they also understood the mathematics of the situation developing in the Kandahar Valley. Even Ghost Kozlova had never attempted anything quite like this. She keyed the radio one more time, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that would either save lives or end her career. Reaper 6, Ghost is inbound. ETA 15 minutes. Mark your positions with IR strobes and keep your heads down. We're coming in hot. The silence that followed stretched long enough that she wondered if the transmission had been lost. Then Hansen's voice came back, and for the first time in years, she heard something approaching gratitude from a SEAL team leader. Copy that, Ghost, we'll be ready. Kozlova grabbed her helmet and headed for the door, knowing that in the next hour, she would either prove that some missions were truly impossible or demonstrate why they called her Ghost. The nickname had nothing to do with her ability to disappear. It came from her talent for appearing exactly where the enemy least expected, striking like a phantom and vanishing before they could respond. Outside, her F-35 Lightning II sat on the tarmac like a predator waiting to hunt. The aircraft's angular surfaces seemed to absorb the dim light from the runway markers, giving it an almost supernatural appearance in the pre-dawn darkness. Ground crew members moved around it with the efficiency of pit crews, conducting final checks and loading ordnance that would be needed for the mission ahead. As she approached the fighter, Kozlova could see her reflection in the cockpit's reinforced canopy. 42 years old, with silver threading through dark hair that she kept regulation short, and eyes that had seen too much but never looked away. The kind of pilot who flew when others stayed grounded, who found ways through impossible situations that existed only in the narrow spaces between certain death and miraculous survival. Chief Master Sergeant Torres met her at the aircraft's ladder, his weathered face creased with concern. "Ma'am, the weather's getting worse by the minute. We're looking at zero visibility above 8,000 feet, with icing conditions and turbulence that could rattle your teeth loose. Maybe we should wait for—" "Chief, those SEALs don't have time to wait for perfect conditions. How's my bird?" Torres straightened, recognizing the tone that meant the discussion was over. "Fueled and armed, ma'am. 2,000 rounds of 25-4 Hellfire missiles, and the targeting pod is calibrated and ready. But ma'am, with respect, flying into that weather, over that terrain, to hit targets you can't see from directions that'll put you in the crosshairs of every anti-aircraft weapon in the valley. It's not tactically sound." Kozlova paused with one foot on the ladder, looking back at the veteran crew chief who had been maintaining her aircraft for 3 years. Torres had seen her fly missions that defied logic and return with stories that sounded like fiction, but even he seemed shaken by what she was proposing. "Chief, sometimes tactically sound is a luxury we can't afford. Sometimes you have to choose between impossible and necessary." She climbed into the cockpit, her movements automatic after thousands of hours in similar seats. The familiar ritual of strapping in, connecting systems, and running through pre-flight checks provided a moment of calm before the storm that waited beyond the mountains. The F-35's advanced systems came online with soft electronic chimes, displaying information about weather, threats, and the mission profile that was already loaded into the aircraft's computers. As the engine spun up to taxi power, Kozlova could feel the aircraft's eagerness to fly. The Lightning II was a technological marvel, capable of stealth operations that could penetrate the most sophisticated air defense systems. But tonight, stealth would be secondary to speed, accuracy, and the kind of flying that existed at the absolute limits of both human and machine capability. The tower's voice crackled through her headset. "Ghost, you're cleared for takeoff. Weather update shows conditions worsening rapidly. Last chance to abort and wait for daylight." She pushed the throttles forward, feeling the F-35's massive engine respond with a roar that seemed to challenge the mountains themselves. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with gathering momentum, lifting off into darkness that seemed to swallow the world beyond the cockpit's glow. "Tower Ghost is airborne. See you on the flip side." As the F-35 climbed into the night, Kozlova could see the weather system approaching from the west, a wall of clouds and storms that turned the sky into a battlefield before she even reached the valley. But somewhere ahead, men were dying while waiting for help that might never come. She had 15 minutes to prove that impossible was just another word for untested. The first indication of how bad things had become came when she tried to establish communications with the SEAL team's forward air controller. Static filled her headset, broken by fragments of transmissions that painted a picture of a situation deteriorating rapidly. "Taking fire from multiple positions. North Ridgeline. Can't get a visual on. Bravo team is pinned down. Need immediate. RPG teams have us zeroed. Ghost, where are you? We're running low on." The transmission cut off entirely, replaced by the kind of electronic silence that meant either equipment failure or something worse. Kozlova adjusted her radio frequency, trying to reestablish contact while her aircraft buffeted through increasingly turbulent air. The weather system was moving faster than predicted, turning what should have been a challenging flight into something approaching suicidal. At 12,000 feet, she entered the cloud base, and the world outside her cockpit vanished into gray nothingness. The F-35's instruments became her only connection to reality as she flew through air that seemed determined to tear her aircraft apart. Ice began forming on the canopy despite the heating system, and turbulence threw her against her restraints with enough force to leave bruises. But she had flown through worse weather, over more dangerous terrain, with less advanced equipment. What made this mission different wasn't the conditions. It was the mathematics of the tactical situation waiting in the valley below. Reaper 6 Ghost, radio check, how copy? Silence stretched for almost 30 seconds before Hansen's voice came through, distorted by static and interference, but carrying an unmistakable note of relief. Ghost, Reaper 6. We have you on thermal. Thank God you're here. Situation has deteriorated significantly since our last transmission. We've taken casualties, and enemy is massing for what appears to be a final assault on our position. Kozlova descended through the cloud deck, breaking into clear air at 8,000 feet to see the valley spread out below her like a tactical nightmare made manifest. The SEAL positions were marked by infrared strobes that looked like tiny stars against the darker background, but they were surrounded by muzzle flashes that lit up the ridgelines like a deadly constellation. Reaper 6, Ghost has visual on your position. I count at least 40 enemy firing positions in elevated terrain surrounding your location. This is going to require multiple attack runs with precise timing. Can you mark priority targets? Ghost, we're down to our last laser designator, and frankly, they're all priority targets. Enemy has us in a perfect crossfire, and they're closing distance for final assault. We need danger close support, and we need it now. Danger close. The words that every close air support pilot dreaded and respected in equal measure. It meant dropping ordnance close enough to friendly forces that the margin for error disappeared entirely. A few meters too far in any direction would kill the people she was trying to save. Kozlova banked the F-35 into a wide circle around the valley, using her targeting pod to analyze the enemy positions with the dispassionate precision that had kept her alive through 3 deployments. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the tactical situation. The enemy had prepared this ambush with professional competence, positioning their forces in mutually supporting positions that provided overlapping fields of fire while minimizing their exposure to air attack. Mortar teams were dug into reverse slope positions that would be almost impossible to hit from the air, while RPG teams occupied caves and fighting positions that had been prepared well in advance. But she could also see the weakness in their deployment. They had positioned themselves to destroy the SEAL team, but they hadn't expected close air support to arrive through a weather system that should have grounded all aircraft. Their anti-aircraft weapons were oriented toward the most likely approach routes, leaving narrow corridors where a sufficiently skilled pilot might be able to penetrate their defenses. The question wasn't whether she could identify targets and deliver ordnance accurately. The question was whether she could do it fast enough to prevent the final assault that would overrun the SEAL positions before help could arrive. Reaper 6, Ghost beginning attack run. Heads down, danger close ordnance inbound. She rolled the F-35 into a steep dive, descending toward the valley floor at speeds that turned the aircraft into a meteor streaking through the night sky. Her targeting system locked onto the first cluster of enemy positions, calculating ballistics and wind compensation with computer precision, while she manually adjusted for factors that no computer could anticipate. At 2,000 feet, she released her first Hellfire missile, watching the weapon's infrared signature arc toward a mortar position that had been hammering the SEAL team for the past hour. The explosion lit up the mountainside, followed immediately by secondary detonations as stored ammunition cooked off in the intense heat. But even as the first target disappeared in flames, muzzle flashes erupted from a dozen other positions, and she realized that killing the enemy wasn't going to be enough. She needed to break their will to fight, to create enough chaos and destruction that they would abandon their positions and retreat rather than continue the assault. The F-35 screamed over the SEAL positions at barely 500 feet, close enough that she could see individual figures moving among the rocks below. Her 25 cannon erupted in a sustained burst that walked explosive rounds along a ridgeline where enemy fighters had been concentrating for their final push. Good hits, Ghost. You got at least 6 of them with that run, but they're still massing on the North Ridge, and we're taking heavy mortar fire from positions we can't see. Kozlova pulled up sharply, climbing back into the clouds to avoid the anti-aircraft fire that was now reaching toward her like deadly fingers. Her aircraft shuddered as something, possibly shrapnel from a near miss, struck the fuselage, but all systems remained green as she set up for another attack run. The second pass was even more dangerous than the first. The enemy had identified her approach pattern and adjusted their defensive fires accordingly. Tracer rounds created streams of light that crisscrossed her flight path, and at least 2 surface-to-air missiles launched from positions she couldn't identify through the darkness and smoke. But she had been flying combat missions when some of these enemy fighters were still children, and she understood the psychology of air-to-ground combat in ways that couldn't be taught in any school. She varied her approach angle, used terrain masking to break radar locks, and timed her attacks to coincide with friendly suppressive fire that forced the enemy to keep their heads down at exactly the wrong moments. Her second Hellfire missile eliminated a machine gun nest that had been enfilading the SEAL positions from an elevated cave entrance. The weapon's shape-charge warhead penetrated deep into the rock before detonating, bringing down enough of the ceiling to bury whatever remained of the position's occupants. Outstanding, Ghost. That was the position that had us pinned down. We're moving to better cover while they're still stunned from the blast. But even as the SEAL team repositioned, Kozlova could see that the fundamental tactical situation remained unchanged. The enemy still held the high ground, they still outnumbered the Americans by at least 4-1, and they still had enough heavy weapons to make any movement across open ground a suicide mission. What she needed wasn't just accuracy. She needed to create the kind of shock effect that would convince a numerically superior force to abandon positions they had spent days preparing. She needed to demonstrate that continuing the fight would cost them more than they were willing to pay. The third attack run took her lower and slower than any sane pilot would attempt in contested airspace. She came in from an unexpected direction, using a narrow canyon that forced her to fly between rock walls separated by less than her aircraft's wingspan. The approach was so dangerous that the enemy didn't expect it, giving her precious seconds of surprise that she used to devastating effect. Her remaining 2 Hellfire missiles struck within seconds of each other, eliminating a command post and an ammunition cache that had been hidden in what the enemy thought was a perfectly concealed position. The combined explosions created a fireball that rose hundreds of feet into the air, visible for miles in every direction and serving notice that nowhere in the valley was truly safe from the aircraft circling overhead. But it was her fourth and final attack run that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it, enemy and friendly alike. Coming in at maximum speed and minimum altitude, she strafed enemy positions with her 25 cannon in a sustained burst that lasted almost 15 seconds and expended nearly half her remaining ammunition. The cannon's high-explosive incendiary rounds walked along the ridgeline like footsteps of some angry god, each detonation creating a sphere of destruction that eliminated not just individual fighters, but entire sections of their defensive positions. Rock and steel and human flesh were consumed equally in the inferno that followed her aircraft's passage. When the echoes of the last explosion faded, the valley fell silent except for the distant sound of her engines as she climbed back into the clouds. Below, the surviving enemy fighters began abandoning their positions, unwilling to continue a fight against an opponent who seemed capable of striking anywhere at any time with lethal precision. Ghost, Reaper 6. I don't know how you did that, but it worked. Enemy is withdrawing from all positions. We count at least 30 KIA on their side with significant equipment destroyed. You just saved our asses in a way that's going to be talked about for years. Kozlova keyed her radio, trying to keep the exhaustion out of her voice. Reaper 6, Ghost. Glad we could help. Are you able to move to a better position for extraction? Affirmative, Ghost. We're moving to the primary extraction point now. And Ghost, I owe you a beer. Hell, I owe you a brewery. As she turned her aircraft toward home, Kozlova reflected on the mission that had just concluded. She had flown into impossible conditions, engaged a numerically superior enemy in terrain that favored their defensive positions, and emerged victorious through a combination of skill, technology, and what some would call luck, but she preferred to think of as preparation meeting opportunity. But even as she savored the satisfaction of a successful mission, she knew that victories like this one came at a cost that wasn't always immediately apparent. Her aircraft had taken damage that would require extensive maintenance. She had expended her entire load of precision ordnance, and she had pushed both human and mechanical systems to their absolute limits. The flight back to base took her through weather that had continued to deteriorate, forcing her to rely entirely on instruments while flying through turbulence that made her earlier approach seem like a pleasure cruise. Ice accumulated on her aircraft's surfaces faster than the heating system could remove it, and at one point, her altitude indicator showed readings that couldn't possibly be accurate unless she was flying upside down. But she made it back to forward operating base Crimson as dawn was breaking over the mountains, touching down on a runway that was barely visible through blowing snow and freezing rain. Ground crews were waiting for her, and she could see emergency vehicles positioned along the taxiway in case her damaged aircraft couldn't make it to the parking area under its own power. Chief Master Sergeant Torres met her at the aircraft as she shut down the engines, his expression mixing relief and professional concern as he began his preliminary assessment of the damage her F-35 had sustained during the mission. "Ma'am, how's the bird?" Kozlova pulled off her helmet, feeling the weight of fatigue and adrenaline beginning to settle into her bones. "She'll need some work, Chief, but she brought me home. That's all I can ask." As she climbed down from the cockpit, she could see other members of the ground crew gathering around the aircraft, their faces reflecting a mixture of professional curiosity and something approaching awe. Word of the mission had already begun to spread through the base, and she realized that what had happened in the Kandahar Valley would become one of those stories that grew with each retelling. But right now, all she wanted was a hot shower, a meal, and 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep. The debriefing could wait until she had recovered enough to think clearly about what had happened and how it might influence future missions in similar circumstances. As she walked toward the operations center, her radio crackled with an incoming transmission from higher headquarters. The voice belonged to Colonel Marcus Webb, her commanding officer, and even through the electronic distortion, she could hear the tension that came with receiving preliminary reports of an unauthorized mission conducted in violation of several direct orders. "Ghost, report to my office immediately upon landing. We need to discuss what happened out there." She keyed her handheld radio, wondering if her career was about to end the same way it had been conducted, with her doing what she believed was right regardless of the potential consequences. "Copy that, sir. Ghost inbound to your location." The operations center buzzed with activity as she entered, with personnel monitoring multiple situations across the theater of operations. but she could feel the attention focusing on her as she walked through the room, aware that every person present had heard at least fragments of the radio traffic from her mission. Colonel Webb's office was located on the second floor of the building, behind a door marked with his name and rank in regulation lettering that somehow managed to look intimidating despite its mundane appearance. She knocked twice and waited for permission to enter, using the few seconds of delay to prepare herself for a conversation that could determine the rest of her military career. Enter. Webb was seated behind his desk, reviewing what appeared to be a preliminary mission report that had been transmitted from the SEAL team's location. His expression was unreadable as she entered the room and assumed the position of attention, waiting for him to acknowledge her presence or begin the discussion that would define how the previous night's events were officially recorded. The silence stretched for almost a minute before he looked up from the paperwork, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that she had learned to associate with moments when careers hung in the balance. Lieutenant Colonel Kozlova, you were specifically ordered not to launch any aircraft until weather conditions improved, and we had better intelligence on the tactical situation in the Kandahar Valley. You chose to ignore those orders and conduct an unauthorized mission that put Air Force assets at risk without proper command approval. She remained at attention, knowing that anything she said at this point would be used to determine not just her immediate fate, but the precedent for how similar situations would be handled in the future. Furthermore, Webb continued, you engaged enemy forces in danger-close proximity to friendly forces, using tactics that violated standard operating procedures and placed both your aircraft and the ground forces at unnecessary risk. The words hung in the air between them, and Kozlova found herself thinking about the mathematical precision required to drop ordnance close enough to save lives without ending them. The margin for error had been measured in meters, and she had threaded that needle 4 separate times while flying through whether that should have made accurate weapons delivery impossible. However, Webb said, and she could hear the shift in his tone that suggested the conversation was about to take an unexpected direction. I also have a preliminary report from SEAL Team 7 that describes your actions as tactically brilliant and executed with a level of skill that prevented what would have been a catastrophic loss of life. He stood up from behind his desk, moving to the window that overlooked the flight line where her F-35 was already surrounded by maintenance crews working to assess and repair the damage from her mission. Major Hansen's report specifically states that your intervention saved the lives of 12 Navy SEALs and prevented the loss of classified equipment that would have compromised ongoing operations throughout the region. He recommends you for immediate decoration and suggests that your tactics be incorporated into training programs for future close air support missions. Kozlova allowed herself to breathe for the first time since entering the office, but she knew that Webb wasn't finished with his analysis of the night's events. The question I'm faced with, he continued, is whether to discipline an officer who violated direct orders or commend a pilot who saved American lives through the kind of flying that people will be talking about for decades. It's the kind of decision that defines not just individual careers, but the culture of the entire Air Force. He turned back to face her, and she could see that he had already made his decision, but wanted her to understand the complexity of the situation that her actions had created. Ghost, what you did last night was either the most impressive display of airmanship I've seen in 30 years of military service, or the most reckless disregard for authority and safety protocols in Air Force history. Probably both. The admission surprised her, and she realized that Webb understood something about leadership that couldn't be taught in any school or learned from any manual. Sometimes the right decision looked exactly like the wrong decision, and the only way to tell the difference was to wait for the results to become clear. Sir, those SEALs were going to die if someone didn't do something. Weather conditions weren't going to improve. Enemy forces were preparing for a final assault, and waiting for proper authorization would have meant writing letters to 12 families explaining why we let their sons die while we followed proper procedures. Webb nodded slowly, and she could see that he had expected exactly that response from her. That's what I thought you'd say, and that's why I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross instead of a court-martial. But Ghost, I need you to understand something. What you did can't become the standard. We can't have pilots making independent tactical decisions without command authority, no matter how well-intentioned or how successful the outcome. The contradiction was obvious to both of them. How do you commend someone for actions you can't officially condone? How do you maintain discipline and chain of command while recognizing the kind of initiative that saves lives when following orders would have been catastrophic? I understand, sir. I won't make it a habit. Webb actually smiled at that, the first break in his serious demeanor since she had entered the office. Ghost, somehow I don't think you'll have to. Missions like last night's don't come along very often, and when they do, I suspect we'll be fortunate to have pilots capable of handling them. As she left his office and walked back through the operations center, Kozlova realized that something fundamental had changed in how she was perceived by the people around her. The conversations that had been taking place when she entered the building resumed, but now they included frequent glances in her direction and fragments of discussion that she couldn't quite hear but could certainly interpret. The story of the mission was already spreading through the base, growing and evolving with each retelling as stories do in military communities. By evening, she knew, it would have reached every unit in the theater of operations. By the end of the week, it would be in staff colleges and training centers around the world, analyzed and dissected and incorporated into lessons about close air support and tactical aviation. But right now, it was still just the memory of flying through impossible weather to save the lives of 12 men who had needed help and trusted her to provide it. The rest, the decorations and the recognition and the legendary status that would follow, seemed less important than the simple fact that she had been in the right place at the right time with the right skills to make a difference. Chief Master Sergeant Torres found her in the pilot's lounge an hour later, carrying a preliminary damage assessment that would determine how long her F-35 would be grounded for repairs. "Ma'am, we've completed our initial inspection of your aircraft. She took more hits than we originally thought, at least 3 from small arms fire, and 1 from what appears to be shrapnel from an RPG that detonated close enough to leave marks, but not close enough to cause serious damage." Kozlova looked up from the coffee she had been nursing, feeling the familiar mixture of affection and concern that came with learning about damage to an aircraft that had become as much partner as machine during her years of flying. "How long until she's mission-ready again, Chief?" 48 hours for the critical systems, maybe 72 if we find any problems we haven't identified yet. The important thing is that none of the damage affected flight-critical systems. She brought you home safe, and that's what matters. As Torres left to continue his work, Kozlova reflected on the strange relationship between pilot and aircraft that developed over years of flying together through situations that tested both human and mechanical limits. Her F-35 had been manufactured in a factory by people who never expected to meet the person who would depend on its performance in life-or-death situations. But after hundreds of hours together, it had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The airplane didn't care about decorations or recognition, or the stories that would be told about the mission. It simply performed its function with mechanical precision, responding to her inputs and providing the capabilities she needed to accomplish whatever task she set for herself. In a world of increasing complexity and uncertainty, that kind of reliability was precious beyond measure. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Major Lisa Park, the intelligence officer responsible for post-mission analysis and threat assessment. Park carried a folder marked with classification stamps that indicated the kind of information that would never appear in official histories, but determined how future missions would be planned and executed. Ghost, I need to debrief you on what we learned from last night's mission. The intelligence picture of enemy capabilities in the Kandahar Valley was significantly incomplete, and your observations during the engagement provide critical information for future operations in the area. The debriefing lasted 2 hours, covering everything from enemy tactics and equipment to the effectiveness of different approach routes and weapon systems. Park asked detailed questions about timing, accuracy, and the psychological effects of the attack on enemy morale and cohesion. What emerged from the discussion was a picture of an enemy force that had been better prepared and more professionally competent than intelligence estimates had suggested. The ambush of SEAL Team 7 had been planned with careful attention to terrain, weather, and likely American responses. If not for the intervention of close air support that arrived through conditions that should have made flying impossible, the engagement would have ended very differently. Ghost, based on your observations and the physical evidence we've collected from the battle site, we're revising our assessment of enemy capabilities throughout this region. What you encountered last night wasn't a typical insurgent force. It was a well-trained unit with professional military experience and access to equipment that suggests external support. The implications were significant. If similar forces were operating in other areas, American units throughout the theater could find themselves facing threats that were more dangerous and sophisticated than current intelligence estimates suggested. But that was a problem for strategists and planners to solve. Kozlova's responsibility was more immediate and personal, being ready for the next mission that would require flying into impossible conditions to save lives that depended on her skill and judgment. As the debriefing concluded, she realized that the events of the previous night had changed more than just the tactical situation in one remote valley. They had established a new standard for what was possible when human skill combined with advanced technology to overcome odds that mathematical analysis suggested were insurmountable. The question wasn't whether she would be asked to attempt similar missions in the future. The question was whether she would be able to maintain the level of performance that had made the impossible seem routine, at least for one night in the mountains of Afghanistan. Walking back to her quarters as the sun set behind the peaks that surrounded forward operating Base Crimson, Lieutenant Colonel Vera Ghost Kozlova understood that some victories created as many challenges as they solved. But she also knew that when the next impossible mission presented itself, she would be ready to prove once again that the difference between heroism and recklessness was often nothing more than the outcome. The radio message that would change her life arrived 3 days later, just as her F-35 was completing its post-mission maintenance and returning to full operational status. The transmission came directly from Pentagon headquarters, bypassing normal command channels in a way that immediately indicated its importance and sensitivity. Ghost, this is Falcon Prime. You are directed to report to Andrews Air Force Base for immediate consultation regarding Operation Nightfall. Transportation is being arranged. Acknowledge receipt and provide estimated time of availability for travel. Operation Nightfall wasn't a designation she recognized, but the priority and classification level of the message suggested something that would make her recent mission look like a training exercise. She acknowledged the transmission and began preparing for a journey that would take her from the mountains of Afghanistan to the corridors of American military power. But even as she packed her gear and prepared for whatever challenge awaited her in Washington, Kozlova couldn't shake the feeling that the real test of her abilities was yet to come. The mission in the Kandahar Valley had been about saving lives in an immediate crisis. Whatever Operation Nightfall involved, it would likely require her to think beyond individual battles and consider the broader implications of how air power could be used to shape conflicts that hadn't yet begun. As her transport aircraft lifted off from forward operating Base Crimson, she watched the familiar landscape of Afghanistan disappear beneath clouds that reminded her of the weather she had flown through to save SEAL Team 7. But she was no longer the same pilot who had made that flight. She had become something more, a symbol of what was possible when training, technology, and determination combined in the hands of someone willing to risk everything for the mission. The question was whether that symbol could live up to the expectations that would inevitably follow, and whether the skills that had made her legendary in one context could adapt to challenges that hadn't yet been imagined. But as the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude and turned east toward Washington, Lieutenant Colonel Vera Ghost, Kozlova knew that she was ready to find out. Some missions defined careers, others defined legends, and a very few defined the future itself.